Excited to follow up today. We've got first up talking a little bit about soil as medicine is going to be Daphne Miller again. We really appreciate her insights and coming from the other end of the spectrum and how we can help create a healthier food product and a healthier society. So looking forward to what Daphne's got to share with us here this morning. So please welcome once again Daphne Miller.
Thank you. Good morning. And first of all, I want to thank you all for allowing this stranger, this non-farmer, non-agricultural person in your midst. And I am sorry if I say anything that sounds completely out of it. I really am actively learning from all of you. I realized that yesterday I was trying out some very new ideas and perhaps didn't connect the dots as well on some of them. So I thought today was actually a good opportunity for me to circle back and do some of that where I have a little bit more than 17 minutes. Sometimes that format is a little challenging for me. But just to give you guys a little bit of context, actually, I don't work in this room anymore, but I work in a room very similar to this now, but without the fancy art on the wall. Just for you to understand how I spend a lot of my days. Not as fun as yours. I don't get to be out there in the fields as often, and I have to fight for that. But I still am, very much a practicing physician, and I kind of have to steal time from my practice to be able to get here. I want to share with you three kind of scenarios or stories that I have learned as I have traveled around and met with farmers and been actively learning from you. And the first one I'm going to call soil as vitamin. And I want this to be a little more informal. So if I am saying something that isn't clear, or if you have a thought or want to contribute something, just chime in, okay? Let's have this be a little bit more of a discussion. But this was actually my introduction to regenerative agriculture, and it happened, now about 7-8 years ago, maybe more like 9 years ago. And it's with these two farmers, Eric and Wendy Hawkinson. Does anybody know them? They farm in the Snoqualmie in Washington State. And by the way, when I show this to medical audiences, they all break into laughter at Eric's T-shirt. But I guess for you guys, it's an old joke there. But their story was super interesting, and they were the first set of farmers that welcomed me onto their farm for really what was a month-long internship that I took away from my medical practice to spend working with them. And their story was super interesting because Eric and Wendy were not born into farming. They are first-generation farmers, and in fact, Eric got a fancy PhD in divinity somewhere and then was a salmon fisherman in Alaska for a while. And then finally had saved up enough money to buy 12 acres of land in a little bit east of Seattle in Washington State. And his mission, the why of his work, very much like Gabe's, was to nourish his community and bring soil wealth and health to his community. But he didn't really have a great sense of how he was going to do that or what his approach to agriculture was. So he bought a lot of conventional agronomy books and started to tackle his soil. And what he quickly realized was that his soil was a mess. It had actually been in monoculture for years, despite being right next to the river there and having all this nice silt that would come over in the rainy season. It had been in monoculture, and then kids, once it stopped being farmed, kids were using it as their dirt bike track, which is another way, clearly, that you can have a massive amount of soil loss and soil erosion. So what his agronomy textbooks were telling him to do was something that he calls test and replace, where basically he was taking little test tubes of soil from around his 12 acres and marking them on this plot and sending them off to a lab, and then getting reports back of what was missing in terms of minerals and purchasing these minerals and putting them in the soil. And he had someone who was coming on his land and consulting with him. And he was doing this over and over, season after season, and seeing some little shifts in terms of the profile of his soil, but nothing that seemed incredibly remarkable. And at the same time, he was farming in a very traditional way with plowing the soil and sort of doing these big plots of land under one type of vegetable. It was vegetable farming, but it was kind of, very, very standard row cropping. Now, the test and replace story that he told me, for me as a doctor, resonated incredibly, because guess what we do in medicine? Test and replace. You go into your doctor, you say you're not feeling so good, you're a little weak, you have this symptom or that symptom. Oh, let's take a bunch of tests, in little vials that look exactly like this with your blood, send it to the lab. Oh, your iron's too low, your vitamin D's too low, we'll go ahead and replace it. And that's really a lot of what ends up happening in the way, this kind of mechanistic way that we think about trying to get humans healthy. Very much, breaking it down into parts and numbers. And, so often in my medical practice, this is exactly what happens, is people who've been under the test and replace system for years, they come in to see me feeling like hell, not getting any better, and with a pile of pills. And this is just literally one patient and what she emptied out of her shopping bag on one of her first visits into my office, and this is what she's taking every day. And this is not an outlier. This is like very standard in America. We're all being tested and replaced, and so is our soil. So at a certain point, Eric had enough. He said, this is not working for me. I've got to think of a different system. And so what he did was he actually threw out all his agronomy textbooks, and he started reading really more of the sort of farming philosophers of the early 20th century, people like Rudolf Steiner, who originated the biodynamic movement, and Sir Lady Balfour, and Sir Albert Howard. And what all of these people had in common was that they, in fact, had been living in parts of the world, whether it was East Africa or Bavaria or what have you, where they had had the opportunity to observe traditional farmers who had been farming on the land for centuries and actually protecting their soil and keeping it alive generation to generation. And they were writing about it, and Eric was reading their writings and started to implement what they recommended. And what they recommended was exactly what you have written in the back of the room here. It was farming in nature's image with a huge diversity of plants that weren't just kept segregated from each other in plots, but that were actually planted in between each other in a way that was synergistic both in the soil and then once they get into your belly, in the belly as well. And using animals in their system and keeping the ground covered at all times. And the one thing that's not there that I think is really a very important element is really conserving all resources, including water and so on. And so really thinking of how to farm with a minimal amount of water, which is what Eric started to really implement as well as a dry farming system and trying to use the river as much as possible. And then all of a sudden, everything shifted on his farm. The soil tests came back completely, optimal. And more important than that, his produce started to taste delicious. And it was just clear, he did do bricks testing and other things. He didn't send his produce off to a lab, but it was clear that all of a sudden he was truly growing food for his community and saw this tremendous response in terms of membership in his CSA and in terms of restaurateurs that sort of recognize his produce as being extra flavorful and so on. So I, of course, came to Eric's farm long after this story had taken place. He was already a super popular farm. Everybody in the region seemed to know him. He had all these people who would come on the farm every weekend, and he had an open door policy just like Gabe did. So the farm is always swarming with community members who are trying to help out with harvest and so on. And my first question was, so this is a lovely story. It tugs at my heartstrings. But really, what does this have to do truly with our cells and with our health? What is the mechanism that connects what Eric was doing in the soil and the shift that he made and our health? And so I started to do some research, and I started above ground, just understanding the difference between conventional and regenerative farming. And by the way, the label on his farm is biodynamic, but truly biodynamic, if you look at its rules, is just another form of it. You know, a lot of these things are, in some sense, labels that have slightly different meanings. Like biodynamic, you bury these horns in the ground. There's different things that are very interesting that happen with the solar system and so on that I have not really. I don't mean to. I think it's probably a very important system, but when you look at it at its basics, it really is following these principles. So above ground, when I showed this to a medical audience and I asked them which one of these is healthier, they all nail it, which is amazing to me. And the reason they do is because when in medicine, we're taught to evaluate skin. And you can look at skin and tell healthy skin from unhealthy skin by all the same ways that you can do it by looking at soil. You look for texture. You look for actually not these like smooth areas that have absolutely no hair at all. Actually, hair growth is a sign of vascular growth in the skin. You look for diversity in terms of the way that the skin is formed and so on, and not like a sheeny kind of scarry surface to the skin. So it's really interesting to me how they are actually able to assess soil because they're pretty good at assessing humans. So starting above ground, this is what you see. But then you go down to the next layer, and this is the microbial layer, which both the bacteria and the fungi that are there below the surface, and also the nematodes and all the life in the soil. And you learn, and what I've learned is that between the regenerative soil and the other soil, there's a complete difference in what's happening in the bacterial life, in the fungi and so on. And we heard about this extensively yesterday. But this is sort of the scientific graphing of it. And this is John Regenold, who's a buddy of Eric's up in Washington State, who teaches at Washington State University. Is anybody familiar with John's work? He's done very interesting research comparing, in this plot, he says organic versus conventional, but honestly, that organic should be labeled regenerative, because he's actually used Eric's land to do some of the studies. This is actually 2 strawberry fields in Watsonville, right near here. And everything above that blue line is microbial diversity in the regenerative plot. And everything below the blue line is in the conventional plot. And what this is measuring is relative abundance of diversity. It's not measuring, you know, unique types of microbes. It's measuring abundance. Does that make sense to everybody? So what do you see here? That just for every type of microbe, there's way more of it in the regenerative field than there is in the conventional field. The regenerative field is like this teeming international city of microbes, and the regenerative, the conventional field is kind of like a really small town when it comes to microbes. So now we know what's happening under the soil when we do this kind of farming. So then how does that relate to us? Well, there's really interesting research now that is starting to look at exactly what happens when you have the soil biodiversity, what it means for our health as humans. And this is Pedro Antunes, his research has shifted a little bit now, but he's been doing a lot of this work in Canada, which makes sense because pretty much every other country on the globe, except for the US, will actually pay you to do research on something that isn't sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. But you know, in the US, it's very, very hard to do studies unless there's going to be some product at the end that you can patent and sell. So that's why we're not doing a lot of this research here. But what Antunes has found to me, is really fascinating. And I don't know if is our rhizophagy researcher still here today? I think he might have gone, and that's too bad. But what he's found is not, remember yesterday we were learning about how the roots of the microbes actually migrate into the roots of the plants, bringing nutrients with them, and then are pushed out again into the soil to gather more nutrients. Remember how we were learning about that? Well, it turns out that the story is even more complicated than that, in that specific microbes come in for specific plants and have specific jobs of gathering specific nutrients in the soil and bringing them to that plant. So there's like a lock and key relationship going on. So, you know, just like you all have your own specialty kinds of farming, there's specialty microbes that farm the soil for specialty plants. So when you think about it, when you have all that microbial diversity in the soil, what is it increasing the risk of, or the chances of? It's increasing the chances that you're going to have the right microbe to do the job of harvesting that nutrient for the plant you need. Now, the science is getting a lot more complicated than that, and I know there's a lot of folks out there who are trying to fine-tune the microbes to the crops and selling you the jug that you might need for that crop. But the more nature's way of doing this is just to get as much diversity in there as possible, so you have so that you're ensured that you have the right microbe. And so it is this kind of full circle of planting as many different kinds of crops as possible, so you get as many different kinds of microbes in the soil, so that you get the microbes you need for your crops. And not only that, but these microbes are really good at enriching these plants with specific nutrients. So, for example, if you are a pomegranate, you really want azobacter in your soil to get a lot of magnesium and copper and zinc and manganese and iron and so on. And guess who those nutrients are really important for? Us. So we are a part of this dance. And without those I showed you yesterday the list of diseases that are very common in humans when we have micronutrient deficiency. And by the way, that list was just a beginning. I could go on for hours giving you lists of diseases that are related to micronutrient deficiency. So the skeptics say, well, what does that mean when it actually comes to measuring nutrient density in fruits and vegetables? And the answer is that what we're seeing is that, in fact, it does march through. So this is, once again, strawberries in a different plot in Watsonville that were under organic. One was conventional, and one is reduced input. The one in the middle is reduced input, you see? And as you move from conventional to reduced inputs to organic, nutrients go up. When I show this to a group of doctors, once again, they're like, yeah, they go up, but it only goes up a little bit. Who really cares about that extra couple micrograms of nutrients, you know, per strawberry? And once again, if you think of this as our total food supply, and all, you know, the sum total of your diet, and this difference over everything that you're eating, it is massive. And that's, you know, it might be a small shift per strawberry, and it's a huge shift in your diet per year. So that is one way that Eric's farming system, or many of your farming systems, impact health. But here's another way that's really fascinating, and this data is just emerging as well, in that our microbiome, those billions of bacteria in our gut and fungi in our gut, might be having a direct conversation with all of the microbes that live in the soil. That there actually might be a swap of DNA that's going on. Now, one of the most direct ways that this is happening is through work like what Stephanie Zeidenbos is doing at Micromama in New Hampshire, but which is now happening all over the US. And once again, we're just taking a page out of cultures all over the world that have fermented food for centuries, right? That is really, that was what we did before refrigeration anywhere on the globe. If you didn't have a refrigerator, you let food rot, but in a very controlled fashion so that you could eat it. And so pretty much every traditional culture on the globe has at least 4 or 5 fermented foods in their diet. And the standard American diet is probably the only diet on the globe that does not have a fermented food that's a part of it. This is incredibly important, not just for food preservation, but for our health. And that what you're doing when you are eating fermented foods, what are you in fact eating? Where do those microbes come from? But where do they come from, those microbes? From the soil. That's lactobacilli that's living in the soil and that gets onto the plants, and then that is what kickstarts the fermentation process, unless you are buying starters, which is another way of doing it. But even those starters originally came from the soil. But controlled fermentation is just basically using fruits and vegetables that have not been sterilized and grains. And letting whatever natural yeast, you guys have all had natural yeast wine, right? That is all because, that's coming originally from the soil. So this is a way of us getting a direct injection into our gut, of soil microbes. And we're doing all this research in medicine with probiotics and trying once again to figure this out in a jug, when in fact we should be studying what these different kinds of fermented foods do to protect us from all these illnesses. This is one that looked at irritable bowel syndrome and probiotics, but for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis and asthma and allergy and so on, we are doing all this research on synthetic probiotics or probiotics that are made in a lab that we can once again patent, and not looking at, in fact, how soil and fermented foods from soil might impact these diseases. And this is very important questions to ask. Here is another way that we are swapping information directly with the soil. This is a study that was done by actually, it was done by a group in Europe, but Justin Sonnenberg, who's an immunologist at Stanford, sort of reported on it. And what they found was that they were looking at a specific kind of seaweed. And they found a bacteria that lived on that seaweed that did an unbelievable job of scavenging nutrients from that seaweed. And they said, this is a really interesting bacteria. It was a Bacteroidetes form of bacteria. They said, we've never seen this kind of bacteria before. But now with 16S RNA, you can do these massive DNA mapping in, use computers to do DNA mapping and search out where you can find the same DNA in another species. And so they put it in, they started to look, where else in the animal kingdom are we finding this same type of bacteria? And they found that it was actually very prevalent in the microbiome of people who are Japanese living in Japan or people of Japanese descent. And they realized, wow, this is because people in Japan eat a lot of seaweed, and they have inherited this trait to be able to digest seaweed and get a lot of nutrients out of it. And so this same microbe had probably originally started off living on the seaweed, but over generations had migrated into the microbiome of people who ate that seaweed a lot and actually become a part of that thumbprint of their microbiome, if that makes sense. So that probably happens a lot. Probably all of us have different microbes that are specific to us, that are part of our history and our trait in the diet that we came through many generations with and were able to sort of digest. Once again, this is something that is not being studied very thoroughly, but we probably all have inherited specific traits in terms of the bacteria in our gut to be able to digest certain foods. And we don't even know, by the way, the time frame on which that happens. So my big lesson from working with Eric was that, in fact, you have two ways that you can get your nutrients, and that I was much more interested in focusing on the one on the right than the one on the left in terms of working with my patients. Another lesson as I started to travel around and work with farmers was one that I referred to yesterday as, immune booster. And it really is this idea that soil can really impact our immune system. This is Cody Holmes, and he would have fit in just perfectly in this room had he been here yesterday and today. He is a holistic rancher in the Ozarks in Missouri. And he actually started off as a very, very traditional rancher. He called himself a Mayflower Rancher. I guess that's the term that a lot of you guys use for the sort of the old-fashioned way of grazing your cattle, just kind of dotting the landscape. And as he started to realize that his soil was getting destroyed and that he couldn't make a living anymore and was having to take work off the farm, he converted to mob grazing and also started to really diversify his ranch and bring in all kinds of other layers to his rotations, including vegetables as well. And when I went to visit Cody, he'd been writing a lot in Acres magazine, which is how I'd found him. And I love how so many farmers have a great way with words. And I went to his ranch and asked him, what was the secret to him being able to turn his whole farm around and make a profit and so on. And he dropped to his knees and he pointed into the earth and he said, it's the billions of unpaid workers underground here who are now doing all, the job for me. But the part of Cody's story for me as a doctor that captured me the most was that he said that since converting to this new form of agriculture, the disease in his cattle had practically disappeared, where he had been spending thousands of dollars a year on vet bills for everything from what sounded to me like some kind of weird colic that his cows would get, if I were to sort of describe it as a human doctor, to really irritable bowel syndrome, to all these upper respiratory infections. He was also having a lot of calf death before, and he said that he stopped losing calves, he stopped having to pay the vet, and he stopped having to buy antibiotics, and just like all of these inputs went away as a result of him shifting to this new form of agriculture. And so I heard Cody's story, and I was really captured by it. But once again, I was like, what do those microbes in the ground have to do with calf death, have to do with changing his healthy cows? Like, yeah, the story sounds good, but I'm a little skeptical here. So that's when I went to meet this lady who I introduced you to yesterday. And this is Erica von Mutius, and she is the head of asthma and allergy at Munich Children's Hospital. Very conventional doctor. There's nothing alternative about this lady. And she runs a huge multi-centered research study called the Gabriella Collaborative that spans all of Europe and some parts of the US. And what they're really trying to do is understand why it is that kids that grow up on these diversified farms that really would be called regenerative farms have such lower rates of asthma and allergy, and now they're actually realizing they have lower rates of autoimmune disease and things like rheumatoid arthritis and ulcerative colitis. And now they're actually even starting to study autism and some other things. But what they're realizing is that these kids in general are healthier. And healthier compared to kids growing up in urban areas, and healthier compared to kids growing up on conventional farms. So they're trying to figure out why. And because Dr. von Mutius is a scientist, she did what scientists do best. she went to the farms and started to actually try and culture things. And when I asked her, what does your typical farm look like where you go and do this research, she went to her computer and she pulled up this image. She said, these are the places that I study. And what she does is she descends on these farms with packets of swabs with all her research fellows, and they swab everything, okay? They swab the babies, they swab the cows, they swab the hay, they swab the raw milk, which is something obviously that's very controversial here in the US. They swab the soil, they swab the bedding, goes on and on and on. They just get this huge collection of swabs, and they bring them back to the lab. And then what they do is they have their control environments, which are conventional farms or urban areas where her patients with asthma live, and they go there and they swab everything. And they study this, they compare what they find in the two labs from a microbial standpoint. And what do you think they found when they compared the diversified farms to the conventional farms or to the apartments? Well, there's a complete difference in the diversity of microbes, both bacteria and fungi. So the y-axis, and I'm sorry I'm showing graphs, but you guys can handle it. The y-axis is diversity, and the blue line is the kids living on these diversified farms, and the red line is kids with asthma in the city. And as I said, the y-axis is diversity of bacteria and fungi. So what you see is that the kids living on farms were really living in this soup of bacteria and fungi. And by the way, within that soup, they found some unique strains like Listeria and Clostridia and different kinds of E. coli, things that we're terrified of in medicine. But they found them as part of a much larger soup with very benign and beneficial bacteria and fungi, like lactobacillus and Bacteroidetes and so on. So it was interesting that it wasn't just the lovely bacteria, but it turns out that maybe these more problematic ones, when they're in that diverse environment, are less toxic and less caustic to us. Whereas the kids with asthma in the city, really, it was a one-note song. They really just had a couple kinds of they had plenty of bacteria and fungi in their environment, but it was just not terribly diverse. And as I showed you yesterday on the graph, one of the hypotheses that they're floating is that this loss of biodiversity is really one of the things that's triggering this incredible rise that we're seeing in allergy and asthma and all different kinds of autoimmune disease. Once again, correlation versus causation, we're really trying to figure that out. And the next generation of studies that they're doing is actually extracting different strains of bacteria from the farms and seeing what they do to tickle the immune system. The problem with that, you guys know the problem with that, right? Is we're getting back to jugs again. And that they're trying to figure out these individual bacteria that might play, or fungi that might play a specific role in protecting against allergy and asthma, and to once again maybe patent it. And really what is the secret sauce here? Yeah, the secret sauce in terms of protecting these kids. It's the whole system, right? It's the biodiverse system. It's not finding that one magical microbe that's going to protect these urban children. It's figuring out how do we recreate this kind of biodiversity in all of our lives and all of our environments. And that is a place where the scientific brain is having trouble going because that's complicated. Then you have to think about how to change the whole environment, right? It's not just buying the jug. And this is the challenge that we're having. So once again, I'm going to let you decide how you would like. Yeah. No, the whole system is rigged. I mean, these companies are making, they're making bank on both ends. Yeah, it's a beautiful, from their standpoint, it's a beautiful world. Yeah. So this is a really interesting conversation because there was a lot of conversation yesterday about consumer-driven this and consumer-driven that. And that might feel that way for each individual farmer, but it's actually way more complicated than that, than the larger system, because there are all these lopsided regulations that make it so that the consumer doesn't even know what they want. I mean, if all you've been fed is, you know, all that yellow stuff that I showed yesterday for your whole life from when you were a child, you think that that's what you want. You think Coca-Cola is what is delicious. So, you know, we really do have to, you know, at a certain point, it's not just educating consumers, it's changing the pipeline and making it so that all of that cheap, you know, the cheap inputs to make the Coca-Cola and the Fritos and so on is not cheap anymore. And the only way that will happen is if farmers stop producing it in excess. I mean, we really do have to change the pipeline. And I do not have the one answer to that, but my approach has been to work with farmers. But you know, the incentives have to change too. I'm going to talk to you just quickly, one last concept with soil, okay? And then we can kind of put the ideas together. This is soil as an antidepressant, okay? And this is not a perfect regenerative farming model that I'm about to show you. This is actually just really a shift in a corporate model, but it's an interesting one. And it's these two farms here that are in Arkansas. Can you see where the two farms are? The one on the left and then the one on the right, they're owned by the same guy. Actually, if you were to go inside these two farms, this is what you see. That's me, the big chicken on the right. And actually, I wasn't allowed to take pictures on the one on the left. So in fact, that isn't a photo from inside those barns. It's just one that I found on the internet, but it looked exactly like those barns because the farmers were all over me. They wouldn't let me even take my camera out on the one on the left because they don't want to show that. But they were very happy for me to take pictures on the one on the right. So this is the Vital Eggs label. Anybody familiar with that? It's actually a cooperative label. Do you guys know what these eggs would be labeled if you were to buy them in the supermarket? The ones on what? What the ones on the left are what? Cage-free, you think? And the ones on the right are what? That's what you get on the consumer side. Because they are free range. And there is a little hole in the wall somewhere where you can go outside, apparently, but none of the hens can find it because their butts are blocking it. Well, I feel a lot better about the one on the left now. And they're fed organic mash. The ones on the right, as I said, it's not a perfect system. It's not Gabe's system, and there's still an awful lot of inputs going into the one on the right. They are eating off pasture, and they are rotating the pasture, but you know, you don't have cows going over it and vegetables being grown on it and so on. So it's not the same kind of rich soil you're getting. But still, for a corporate egg model, we got an improvement there, right? If you were a hen, or do we have our herd dog expert here in the room? She can tell us which one of these animals is happier, right? The one on the left or the one on the right. But the reason I love talking about this is from a medical standpoint, we have a whole other reason to think that the ones on the right are happier. And that is that the discovery of this particular bacteria that's in the soil of pastures and is in all of your healthy soil, and in fact is in the soil for gardeners in the city if they're taking good care of their soil. And it's called Mycobacterium vacca. And it's actually related to the tuberculosis bacterium, but doesn't cause tuberculosis. It's a very gentle, kind soil-dwelling bacteria. And it was actually isolated by researchers. It's a long story why, but basically they were trying to study it because they thought it would help the immune system of patients with cancer. And so they gave it in a randomized controlled trial to these patients with end-stage cancer, hoping it would make them live longer. It didn't. But what they found was that the group that had been given this bacteria was reporting these sort of off-the-charts happiness scores in their last days of life. They were realizing they were much less depressed than the ones that hadn't been given the bacteria. And they're like, what the heck is going on here? So they started to study it and its impact on sort of brain function and brain health. And what they found was that, in fact, it was acting a lot in some ways like a Prozac or sort of the serotonin stimulator. And by being in the gut, had some kind of neural communication, maybe through the vagus nerve to the brain. And this has triggered this whole line of research in psychiatry looking at the gut-brain connection in terms of the microbiome. And we found that M. vacca is just one of many bacteria that might do this. And it's led to studies with this kind of these kinds of titles: inflammation, sanitation, consternation, loss of contact with microorganisms, and the treatment of major depression. This idea that as we are once again losing biodiversity, we're actually getting depressed. So another reason why those outdoor hens are happier, they're on soil and actually in contact with these microbes. And I published an article a couple years ago for Yes magazine, and the only reason I put this up there is because I love showing pictures of me with my compost bucket. But it was a whole series that they wrote on the antidepressant, anti-anxiety garden. So the reason that I love to tell this story is, remember Gabe's egg that he showed us yesterday, his nice yellow egg as compared to the conventional egg? Well, have you seen this data, Gabe? This is researchers in Italy who have looked at the nutrient content of those pastured eggs as compared to free-range organic, which is, remember that other barn, as compared to conventional. And what they found was that the pastured eggs for these discrete nutrients had twice the amount of the free-range organic or the conventional. So free-range organic and conventional were kind of the same in terms of nutrient density, and the pastured was much higher. Now, guess what all those nutrients are good for, and not for us? For our nervous system and for our brains. So what I like to do in explaining this to people is that, what's good for the soil is good for the hen, is good for the farmer, is good for the soil. Like, the whole thing works in this big, beautiful cycle. And that is really fantastic. So when you see crazy farmers like Cody on their knees pointing at their soil, what they're really doing is psychotherapy. So I really want you to get the point from this, that when you're thinking like a pharmacologist, and that's really what this conference is about, right? To shift everybody's brain so that we're not thinking in this mechanistic way anymore. And these are two algorithms that I stuck next to each other. One is from a medical textbook and one is from an agronomy textbook. You can't even really tell which is which. One is to replace nitrogen in the soil, and the other one is to replace calcium in a human. But we're stuck in this really reductive way of thinking. Do A or B, test. Do A or B, test. Do A or B. This is not going to get us anywhere. We've really got to start thinking like this. And this is hard. This is complicated. It's also complicated because it's place-based. So everything that's working for Gabe is probably not working for the parks in California. They've got to come up with their own different web of life and their own system that works for them. It also requires what Aldo Leopold called intelligent tinkering, where you don't just go in and impose something on the system, just like you don't go in and just take over a human's health. You let their natural systems work and see where they might need a little nudge here and there to get them to optimum. I mean, that's what real husbandry is, right? Is just being sensitive, being the sensitive husband or wife, and really understanding what your loved one needs. And what I'm finding is that farmers around the country are doing it, including farmers in places where you don't think that farming is going on. Like Karen Washington, who is in the Bronx, who's actually taken over. She now actually has her own farm in upstate New York, but in the time that I was working with her, she had taken over all these little abandoned lots around the Bronx with her colleagues. And this is a place that was a food desert, and she turned it into a virtual farm. So she went basically from this to that in all of these different areas. And when she started to do that and bring this diversity to the Bronx, there was this cascade of unintended consequences. Just like on your farms, when you start to nourish the system, you never know what goodness is going to come of it. Like all of a sudden, the seniors started to come out of their high rises and started to work in the gardens. And one of the huge problems among seniors is deconditioning and vitamin D deficiency and malnourishment. And now they've gotten all this fresh produce and they're getting sunshine and they're squatting and they're lifting. Little business enterprises started as a result of the gardens. These are two ladies that went off into their own businesses. One of them selling, I think was pupusas, and the other one was bagging dried spices. And they're talking to each other about how they're bringing more economy, more money into the Bronx with their businesses. This for me was one of the most striking things that happened was these school kids in PS 58 who used to never leave their concrete play yard because they set up a farmer's market, because they had all this produce nearby, the teachers would bring their kids out of the schoolyards to the farmer's market on Tuesdays, and Karen would give them, each kid, an apple, a free apple. And as a result of that, the kids needed to eat the apple, and so they started to go into that park behind the farmer's market, which is called Tremont Park. Now, this park was an area that nobody in the community went into except for drug dealers and people who wanted to commit crimes. It was sort of off bounds for the community because it was a scary place. But as the police started to see that kids were going into the park to eat their apples, they started to pay attention. And as the farmers market started to take over the park, and so they started to police the park. And the next thing you know, the community floated a bond to redo the park, and now it's this gorgeous park, and this was a couple years ago. They had a big health fair in the park. So, one woman planting vegetables in these abandoned lots had this cascade effect that was, the community never thought would happen. And I know that's an urban story, and it probably doesn't pertain to a lot of you here, but it's actually the same thing that can happen when you start to shift your systems on the farm. And I just love to put Jill Litt's picture up because she's a researcher in public health at University of Colorado who actually studies urban farming and its impact on public health. And she's found that people who do urban farming have better health scores all around. They have less alcoholism, better school performance, less obesity, and there's less crime related to that community that has the urban farms and so on. So, the point of all this, that's the clinic in the Bronx, and that's the urban farm in the Bronx. Where do you want people to get their preventive care? And that's really how we want to transform our communities. I'm going to give you just one other quick example. This is a totally different one. Anybody familiar with Järna in Sweden? This is a whole, town that decided to become a regenerative ag experiment. So it's a beautiful little town on the Baltic that the community was realizing that the farming systems in Sweden were actually being lost to monoculture and being devastated. The soil was being lost just like everywhere else in the world. And so they kind of rebelled and decided we are going to become a community that is all about the soil. And they invited me for one of their first Summers of Soil. It was just kind of an interesting event that happened, where they had all these speakers come to talk about rejuvenating the soil and how they were going to change their communities. But they had already done a tremendous amount. For example, they built a soil museum that tourists could come and look at, and to sort of celebrate the soil of their community. And this is one of the, I just love to put her picture, because they had all these vibrant seniors who had become soil stewards within the community. They gave them these important roles. And the schools were built into the agricultural field. So what the kids didn't have playgrounds, at noon they just went and ran around in the fields. Could you imagine if that happened on Gabe's farm, where he just turned it into a school and let his fields actually become part of the playgrounds? And even the parking lots, even the friggin' parking lots started to have little gardens in them. They just couldn't help themselves. And all the farmers started to do soil testing and publish it on the roadside. So this is a farmer's research published on the roadside about the carbon content of his fields and the biodiversity of his fields. He was, to the heck with journals, I'm going to just publish on the roadside. The hospital itself was right in the middle of a wheat field, and the patients could just be wheeled out and into the fields. And as you can see, they didn't have beautiful manicured lawns. They were sort of allowing weeds to grow and sort of having it look like a sort of this scrubby, biodiverse environment even around the hospitals. And the pharmacy of the hospital looked like some kind of Dr. Hauska showroom. I mean, they weren't selling any pharmaceuticals at all. It was all natural products. It was kind of interesting. So those are just two examples I wanted to give you of communities that really transform themselves through this biodiverse way of thinking. Because at the end of it all, we really are soil. So I can take some questions and share ideas, thoughts, and so on.
Scott, hold on. I'm going to get you the microphone so we can have audio of all the questions and answers. Walking as fast as I can.
So, Dr. Miller, like we wonder on growing our crops, and in fact, you asked me about the rice of nutritional value, and we find that there's a little bit of resistance or indifference to universities looking into the nutrient density. Do you find a little back pressure on that, or is, I kind of get the sense that maybe they don't want to see the nutrient difference?
Well, it's once again what I said, especially on this rice. Who's gonna make the money from that? There is nothing to patent there. So there's just not a lot of funding that comes through the pipeline. And also, it's really complicated to prescribe food. That is overwhelming. We get absolutely no nutrition training in medicine. I had a half day of nutrition training in medical school, and it was how to hang a total parenteral nutrition bag in a very ill patient in the intensive care unit. There was an elective that was offered, but it was also, a very reductive way of thinking. In terms of thinking through whole diets and so on, that has just really not been a focus in our healthcare system. That being said, and you remember Bob Quinn, the guy whose picture I showed you yesterday, who's growing all that primitive wheat in Montana? He got so frustrated with this that he actually started his own foundation and put money aside for researchers to start to study not just his products, but other products. And even with that, he put the money out there. He put in a call for proposals for nutrition researchers in the US to bid on this money to study the nutrient density of what he was producing, but also what other farmers were producing. He wasn't making it just about his work. And he found no takers. And he actually ended up working with researchers in Italy who have been doing a lot of work for him. The Rodale Institute is now stepping forward and is interested in doing some of this work. And I think that's probably one of the more promising places in the US to start to look at this question. But I'm going to say something here that might be a little controversial about nutrient density, and that is that I think we have to be careful because it's only one piece of the puzzle. And if we start to buy into the religion of nutrient density, we might end up really shooting ourselves in the foot, because the health of our farms and what we're producing is not just nutrient density. It's what you're doing to the air. It's what you're doing to the soil. It's the combination of things that you're growing. How well you are actually able to contribute to the nutrition, the macronutrition of that community. And if it's just about growing one super-powered form of rice or one super-powered form of wheat, that is once again falling into that jug trap in a way, to the mechanistic trap of, oh, we can solve this with one product. I'm not saying that it isn't important to study nutrient density, because it can be this wonderful mirror into how your soil is performing. And it's a really great study to do, especially if you're comparing apples to apples. So if you have one variety of rice, one specific genetic variety of rice, and you're measuring it in a beautiful soil like the Parks farm versus some monoculture abused farm, and trying to see how does farming system contribute to that nutrient density, I think that's a great question to ask, because then that tells us how to optimize that agricultural system. Does that make sense? But to go down the rabbit hole of nutrient density for nutrient density's sake, I think that is dangerous. And I know that there's a conference that happens back east that's super focused on nutrient density. I know there's people who are rushing to patent some kind of special pocket tool that you can flash on your plants and figure out how they're doing. What Philip and I found, because we study the nutrient density of weeds, edible weeds, is that it's incredibly variable too. I mean, you really can, even with the same genetics, depending on different days and how you run the thing and so on. So I'm just introducing a note of caution there. Yes?
Hello. Oh, in your talk yesterday and today, I noticed that you left out.
I think I left out a lot.
Well,
but
you did, but as far as a stakeholder in the process, was the governmental policy.
Yes.
And the plate that you talked about yesterday really is driven by farm subsidies.
Absolutely.
And the fact that the Farm Bill does not address promoting diverse crops or specialty crops or even any produce crops at all.
Right.
And they only subsidize soybean and cotton and wheat and whatnot,
Yes.
and dairy a bit. So how do you in your mind bring that or affect that policy to begin this massive change?
Right. So, yes, of course, that's the elephant in the room, is that, this is a lot of this has been imposed, top down, historically from a system that actually meant meant well. If you look at, how it all started, but now has just literally destroyed our health as a nation. I think it has to be approached in every way possible. There is not one way. So of course, fighting it from a policy standpoint is incredibly important. And hearing I don't know how much how often Gabe has gone to Washington, or if he has the bandwidth to go to Washington. But hearing from farmers like Gabe is really, really powerful in terms of understanding that there is another way and another system. And especially in a state, like North Dakota that only has 5 people in it. Gabe is 1/5 of the voting bloc. And so, he can at least start to really influence his senators there. And so, those kinds of, really having, farmer advocates What's missing are doctor advocates because they don't understand soil and they don't understand agriculture, and doctors have a very strong voice. And so that's a lot of the work that I'm trying to do, is just to get us all on the same team so we're actually, giving the same message. So policy is one piece of it. The other piece of it is that we just have to build this team of renegades and make it bigger and bigger and bigger so that we're no longer fringe. And people who are willing to not take the subsidies and, to actually show that they are doing better, by farming in this different way. I love Bob Quinn's story about how all his neighbors wanted him to fail. And so he realized that the only way he could show them that he was in fact succeeding was to buy the biggest, fanciest combine he possibly could and continually drive it around the perimeter of his property. He didn't want to actually drive it over his fields, but he just used it to show all his neighbors how well he was doing, And so, those are the kinds of things that really start to change mind, the dollars at the end of the day. You can tell these lovely stories, but it really is the dollars. So consumer demand is the third way, through consumer education, but I would not overestimate that. It is amazing how much what we think we want is a product of the system that has been imposed on us. And so really trying, to change our taste buds and change our bellies and change our brains is, a lot of that's going to have to come from the farmers challenging us to try new things. And so it is a two-way street. It's not just producing what they want. It's giving them what they need. And I know that's a lot scarier to do, but that has to be a piece of the puzzle as well. And I think I've just run over, but is there one more question? Yes.
Well, I just want to make a comment, and as a farmer and also as a parent of an oncology kid, I lived this. And, one of the, I'm not picking on your profession, but...
No, go ahead, pick on it. I do all the time.
It was frustrating because I think it's a double-edged sword. People respect doctors. Farmers get beat up every day. It seems like we're up against this challenge all the time because, we're demonized. We're doing this to the soil. We're doing this to the air. We're bad. But I don't hear the medical profession. I mean, I once sat with my oncologist in office and I told him all the healthy diet that I was trying to give my son the foundation for a healthy immune system so he could battle his cancer. But yet he looked at me and he says, Mr. Fernandez, nothing in nature is going to cure your son of this disease. Yeah. It's going to be a chemical or a drug. I just looked at him, I said, I profoundly disagree with you.
Right. I'm going to interrupt you because I'm out of time. I want to respect the conference. But one of the projects that we're doing, and Jeff Mitchell has been a part of it, is really trying to bring in doctors and educate them. And I think that you, Mr. Fernandez, and all these farmers have the opportunity to do that. And one of the ways we're doing it is actually creating these soil labs and bringing doctors onto farms and giving them the physical experience of understanding where healthy food comes from and how it's grown. And it's been a powerful experience. So thank you so much. And I